They told me I was too weird to ever be successful. Now my face is on billboards, and they're asking for VIP passes. I don't even know what to say anymore. They told me I was too weird, not quirky or eccentric in a way that's endearing. No, not the kind of oddness that gets rebranded as creative genius once success rolls around. I was the kind of weird that made people uncomfortable, the kind of different that didn't sit right in parent-teacher conferences, that made uncles exchange glances and whisper during family dinners, that got you uninvited from birthday parties because you make the other kids feel strange. There was never a time when I wasn't reminded, by expressions, sighs, or well-meaning but venom-laced words, that I was not normal, and therefore not right. I remember the moments with a clarity that's almost unfair. Mrs. Halverson in the 5th grade, when I brought in my science project, a kinetic sculpture powered by magnets and solar panels. I'd stayed up 3 nights to build it, and instead of praise, she tilted her head with that squint people use when they're trying not to say something harsh. She suggested next time, I do something a bit more expected, maybe a volcano like the others. The class laughed, not because it was funny, but because they could smell difference, and kids are wired to mock what they fear they might one day become. Then there was the time I wore the outfit. God, the outfit. Neon suspenders, mismatched socks, hand-painted boots with glow-in-the-dark laces. To me, it was art, movement, personality in cotton and canvas. To everyone else, an invitation to call me clown, freak, or attention seeker. I was 13. Just starting to figure out the noise in my head was symphonic, not static, and I tried to dress the part. I got detention for disruption. My parents grounded me, not because I broke any rules, but because they couldn't handle the social fallout. At home, it was no better. My mother once told me, point blank, that the world doesn't reward people who stick out. That if I wanted to succeed, I'd have to learn to dial it back. My father didn't say much. His silences were louder than her lectures. But the day I showed him my sketchbook, filled with illustrations of a post-apocalyptic jazz city where buildings played music and people flew with umbrella wings, he shut it, handed it back, and said, "You should be studying finance. You're not a kid anymore." So I stopped showing them things. But I never stopped making them. My rebellion wasn't loud. It wasn't drugs or running away or screaming matches in the driveway. It was quiet, steady, unrelenting. I created in the shadows, in the corners of my room, on the backs of receipts, in bathroom stalls, under cafeteria tables. Every insult, every scoff, every sideways glance, they didn't shut me down. They fed me. They carved channels in me, and creativity poured into those cracks like molten gold. I took jobs I hated to fund what I loved, worked graveyard shifts stacking shelves in gas stations, cafe and restaurant, where no one knew my name, walked dogs through frozen parks at dawn, and every spare second I built, drew, filmed, recorded. I filled hard drives with projects no one saw. Not yet. But I knew, God, I knew that if I just kept going, something would break. The first crack in the dam came with a video. It wasn't even meant to go viral. Just something I made in a single sleepless night. A chaotic blend of dance, spoken word, glitch art, and costume design, all stitched together under an experimental synth track I'd composed years before. I uploaded it to a throwaway account with no followers, no tags, just tossed it into the void, and the void screamed back. Overnight, the views exploded, not in the gentle way of a rising tide, but like a dam burst. 10,000, 50, 100,000. It wasn't just numbers. It was comments, messages, emails from strangers saying they felt seen, heard, that my strangeness made theirs feel less like a curse and more like a language. Suddenly, the things I was mocked for became marketable. The colors I wore were now bold fashion statements. The music I made, once called noise by my old piano teacher, was now experimental brilliance. The videos I stitched together in the dark corners of anonymity were now visionary storytelling. And the people who once told me to tone it down, they were tagging me, sharing my work, adding emojis of awe and applause. My own mother posted one of my videos with the caption, "Proud mom moment," as if she hadn't begged me to go to accounting school. I remember the first billboard. Sunset Boulevard. My face, blown up 20 feet tall, mouth painted with that same electric green lipstick I'd worn to prom, where no one would dance with me. I stared up at it, sunlight baking into my skin, and for the first time, I didn't feel small. I felt infinite. Not because of the fame, but because the world had finally caught up to what I had always known in my marrow. I was never too weird. I was exactly the right kind. But the irony, oh, the delicious irony, was not lost on me. Suddenly the DMS were full of familiar names. Hey, remember me from school? So proud of you. Always knew you were special. Any chance I could get 2 backstage passes for the show? I read each message with the kind of detached amusement you give to a bad sitcom. Some even tried to name-drop our shared history as if proximity to my past suffering gave them a free pass into my present glory. There was one message that hit harder than the rest. Mrs. Halverson, the same teacher who told me my magnet sculpture was too much. She messaged me on LinkedIn, of all places, congratulated me on my success, said she showed her current students my work as an example of creative resilience. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. I didn't either. I just closed the tab. Because what do you say? What can you possibly say to the people who tried to smother your fire now that they're trying to warm themselves by its blaze? Do you say nothing? Smile graciously and hand out passes like candy, basking in their belated praise? Or do you finally speak the truth, sharp and unfiltered, and let them choke on the bitterness of what they planted? I haven't decided yet. Maybe I never will. Maybe the answer isn't in words at all, but in continuing to rise, to shine, to dance in the ways they once called ugly, to scream in colors they said were too loud. Maybe the best revenge is not a confrontation, but a constellation. A life so vast, so defiantly dazzling, that they can't help but stare up at it in awe, knowing they once tried to pull it down. And yet, sometimes, late at night, I still hear those voices. Not with anger, not with sorrow, just with memory. Echoes of too much, not normal, tone it down. But now they're whispers against the roar of a stadium filled with people who get it, who came not in spite of the weird, but because of it. They're chanting my name, wearing the shirts, reposting the videos, crying in the front row, and for the first time, I don't feel like I have to explain myself. I just take the mic, and I speak in the language they once tried to bury. There's a strange sort of silence in success, one they never tell you about. Not the kind that comes from peace or resolution or even contentment, but a silence made of echoing applause that still hasn't quite settled into the skin. A hush that follows the roar, like the world pausing to catch its breath after screaming your name. That silence lives with me now. It waits in dressing rooms lined with mirrors too clean, lingers in the back seats of black cars that smell like expensive leather and someone's idea of citrus, and curls itself around my ankles as I sit alone in hotel suites with views I once pinned to dream boards taped to bedroom ceilings. I should feel something triumphant. I do, in moments. But it's complicated, this victory. I walk through it like wading through velvet, soft but thick, luxurious but resistant. It gives, but never easily. The tour had barely begun, and already the messages were flooding in like cracked pipes under pressure. Every city we booked, every venue that sold out in under an hour, brought another surge of names from the past, clawing their way back into the present. Some pretended nothing had ever happened, as if they hadn't once rolled their eyes when I spoke, as if they hadn't turned their backs while others laughed. Some cloaked their guilt in compliments. "You always had something special," they wrote, conveniently forgetting the years they worked so hard to convince me otherwise. A few were bolder, brazen even. They asked outright for VIP access, citing childhood proximity like it was some kind of currency. One message came from Evan from high school Evan, the one who once snatched my sketchbook in homeroom and read out loud a poem I'd written about time bending like glass. He'd put on a voice, mocking, nasal, cartoonish, before tossing the notebook into a puddle outside and saying, "Art is for people who can't do math." I hadn't seen his name in years, and there it was, blinking on my screen, cheerful as a summer barbecue. "Yo, I see you're coming to Denver next month. Think you could hook me and my girl up with some backstage passes? Would love to catch up." Catch up? With what? My trauma? My therapy bills? The 10 years I spent unlearning every lie people like him etched into my bones? I didn't respond. Not because I was being kind or above it, but but because the reply that hovered on the tip of my tongue was molten, and I didn't trust myself not to throw it like a dagger. The thing no one tells you about becoming undeniable is that it doesn't heal the wounds. It just frames them in better lighting. I've walked past entire racks of magazines with my face on the cover and still felt the tremor in my chest that comes from hearing your own name as a punchline. Trauma, it turns out, doesn't vanish under spotlights. It adapts, dresses up, learns to pose for the camera, and smile when the makeup artist says, "Almost done." There was a moment, backstage in Chicago, that hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't the crowd. They were electric, screaming, pulsing, waving homemade signs with quotes from my old blog posts. It wasn't the stage either, though the production was flawless. The visuals projected 10 stories high, synced with choreography that made grown men cry. No, it was a face. 5th row, middle seat, pale blue hoodie, brown curls tucked under a beanie. The face of someone I hadn't seen since I was 16. Brielle. She'd been my closest thing to a friend, back when I was half-formed and bursting with ideas that scared most people. She never joined in the ridicule, but she didn't stop it either. She laughed quietly when others were loud, stayed silent when the teachers asked who vandalized my locker. She'd been a ghost in the machine, never cruel, but never kind enough to stop it. That kind of passive betrayal sticks longer than bruises. And yet, there she was, singing along, tears streaming down her face. When our eyes met, something inside me cracked. I didn't miss a lyric, but I sang it like I was spitting blood. Later that night, I found an envelope waiting in the green room. My name in handwriting I recognized instantly. Brielle's scrawling cursive, always a little tilted like it couldn't decide if it wanted to lean in or pull away. I opened it with trembling fingers. "I don't deserve your time," it began. "I just needed you to know I see you now, fully, clearly, and I'm sorry it took this long. No ask, no tickets, no social media tags, just a note and a truth. I didn't know what to do with it. I still don't. I put it in my coat pocket and haven't taken it out since. Because that's the thing, isn't it? This journey, the real one, isn't about the fame. It's about the ghosts. The quiet weight of 1,000 moments where you were made to feel wrong, and how they keep clinging to your shoulders long after you've outgrown the coat. But success, true success, doesn't mean those ghosts vanish. It means you learn how to carry them without letting them steer. You put them in the passenger seat and keep your hands on the wheel. Still, sometimes I wonder, who would I have been if they hadn't tried to carve pieces off of me? Would I be here, standing under lights, adored and adored again, if not for the resistance? Would my art have taken such jagged, beautiful shapes if it hadn't been a shield first? There's no real answer, only momentum. We moved from Chicago to New York, and the moment the skyline came into view from the tour bus, my breath caught. Because there, right above Times Square, was me. Not the me they once laughed at. Not the scared teenager hiding watercolor sketches under a cafeteria table. No, this was the full-spectrum version, the unapologetic version. Eyes rimmed in glitter, arms spread wide in the middle of a leap, caught mid-flight on a billboard the size of a city block. I stared at that image until my manager called my name. Twice. I kept thinking, what would they say now? The old crowd, the teachers, the cousins, the neighbors who used to flinch at my ideas. Would they feel proud? Regretful? Would they feel anything at all? The truth is, it doesn't matter, because I am not doing this for them. I am doing this for every kid who was told they were too loud, too strange, too much, for the ones who got called freaks in locker rooms, who had their notebooks stolen and torn up, for the ones who stopped creating because someone convinced them they didn't have the right. I am doing this for the late-night versions of myself, the one who cried in bathrooms and kept creating anyway, the one who didn't give up. They told me I was too weird. And now? Now I sell weird. Trademark it, broadcast it, charge admission for it. And somehow, miraculously, that weirdness has built an empire where difference isn't just tolerated, it's celebrated. Still, I don't know what to say to them. The ones knocking on the doors they once slammed shut behind me. The ones who couldn't see past their own fear long enough to recognize the brilliance clawing its way out of my ribcage. I don't know what to say. because the part of me that wanted to scream, "I told you so," doesn't burn the way it used to. The fire has changed. It's no longer made of revenge. It's made of creation. And creation doesn't look back. But still, sometimes, late at night, in those sterile hotel rooms that smell like air conditioning and imported linen, I lie awake and wonder if the silence in my success is just the absence of all the noise they used to make trying to drown me out. And if so, maybe silence isn't such a bad thing after all. They say the higher you rise, the lonelier the air becomes. I never quite understood that until the third month of tour, when applause had started to feel routine, like white noise echoing off the marble walls of opulence I never asked for, but now existed within. The suites had grown larger, the dressing rooms quieter, the craft services tables more extravagant. Hand-carved sushi, rare tea, imported chocolates flown in on whims. But none of it tasted like anything. It was luxury on mute, and I was floating through it all like an astronaut untethered, drifting with no gravity to hold me down. At first I tried to keep track of every city, every show, every person who screamed my name as if it had become the chorus to their own survival. I wanted to remember every face, every hand reaching over barricades, every tear-streaked cheek that mouthed lyrics I had written in the dark silence of my lowest moments. But they started to blur. The cities melted into each other, one skyline bleeding into the next like watercolors run wild. I'd wake up in hotel beds and forget what time zone I was in, what day of the week it was, who I was supposed to be meeting, or even what name I was going by that night. Because somewhere along the line, the world had renamed me. They didn't use the one my parents gave me anymore, the one that had echoed down hallways followed by ridicule. They called me by the moniker I had forged, syllable by syllable, from the broken fragments of who I used to be. It was strange how that name sounded when it came from their mouths, like a hymn, like a spell, like I was something mythical. And yet, I still caught myself staring into mirrors, wondering if the person staring back was a myth I had trapped myself inside. One night in Seattle, after a show that left the stage littered with glitter, rose petals, and pieces of fan-thrown artwork, I found myself alone on the rooftop of the hotel. There was no handler, no manager, no camera crew, just the open air and a city pulsing beneath me. I leaned against the railing and let the wind bite into me, cold and sharp, as if to remind me I was still alive. Behind me, the door opened with a creak, and I turned, expecting security or perhaps one of the dancers. But instead, it was Marla, the publicist. She had that look on her face, the one that meant she was about to deliver a piece of news carefully wrapped in layers of professionalism and spin. I raised an eyebrow, waiting. "We've been contacted by a documentary team," she said. "Big name, real prestige. They want to do a full retrospective. Origins, process, rise to fame, all of it." I didn't reply. She hesitated, then continued. "They want interviews, family, teachers, old friends." I laughed then, not a small chuckle but a hollow, echoing thing that bounced off the rooftop walls and vanished into the Seattle night. The idea of dragging those ghosts in front of a camera, letting them smile and reminisce and pretend they had anything to do with who I had become, it made something cold uncoil in the center of my chest. "They weren't friends," I said, my voice low. "They were witnesses, at best, spectators to a suffering they never stopped. At worst, they were architects of it." Marla said nothing for a moment, then softly, "They see you now." That was the problem. They saw me now. Now that I was packaged, edited, curated. Now that my weirdness had a budget and a brand guide. Now that the very things they used to spit on were selling out arenas. They saw me not as a person, but as a success story they could stand next to and say, "I knew them when..." But they didn't know me. Not really. They knew the shape I used to wear. The version of me that bent under their pressure, smiled through their contempt, stayed quiet through their mockery. They didn't know the hours I spent alone, swallowing sobs into pillows that smelled like paint and fear. They didn't know the internal wars I fought just to hold on to a piece of myself while everyone else tried to sand it down. And now they wanted to be part of the story, like authors who show up at the launch party of a book they never helped write. I told Marla I'd think about it, which was a lie. I wasn't thinking about it at all. I was thinking about a performance we'd done 2 nights earlier, in a smaller venue in Portland. A venue that had once hosted a local talent show I'd tried to enter years ago, back when I was nobody, and nobody wanted to know me. They'd rejected my submission, citing it as too abstract, and suggested I try again next year with something more mainstream. I had walked out of that building with my portfolio clutched to my chest, teeth clenched so tight I chipped a molar. And now that same venue had literally begged my team to squeeze them into the tour. They offered double the standard rate. Full control over lighting, a plaque, a mural, a freaking statue in the lobby. I agreed. Of course I did. But I changed the closing number. Instead of the usual finale, a bombastic, crowd-pleasing anthem with pyrotechnics and confetti, I ended the show with a monologue. Just me, under a single spotlight. No music, no filters, no mask. I told them everything. About the rejection. About the humiliation. About the way I stood on that same stage 10 years earlier and was told I wasn't good enough. About how that pain had shaped me, carved something furious and bright and unkillable. There was no applause when I finished. Just silence. Real, breathless, holy silence. And then someone stood. And then another. And then the room was on its feet, roaring, weeping, throwing their arms into the air like they were surrendering to the truth of it. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I just stood there. Because I had finally, fully arrived. And I wasn't going anywhere. Back at the hotel, after Marla had left me alone on the rooftop, I looked up at the stars. I hadn't seen them clearly in a long time. Too many spotlights. Too many skyscrapers. Too many nights ending in after-parties with people who only saw me as the persona, never the person. But the stars, those ancient burning things, they didn't care about my image. They didn't care about my fame. They didn't care about who had mocked me or who was now pretending they hadn't. They just burned. Fierce. Distant. Eternal. Maybe that was the answer. Maybe that's all I ever wanted to be. Not understood. Not forgiven. Not accepted. Just undeniable. And as the wind whipped through my hair and the city below hummed with 1,000 lives that would never know mine beyond the Billboard versions, I whispered something into the darkness. Something I hadn't said aloud since the very beginning, back when I was still scribbling dreams in stolen notebooks and sketching blueprints in the margins of math tests. I said, I'm still that weird kid. And for the first time, I didn't say it like a confession. I said it like a vow. Fame has a way of turning mirrors into windows. Everywhere I went, reflective surfaces no longer showed me my own face. They showed me the crowd. They showed me what they wanted me to be, how they saw me, how they had chosen to interpret the persona I had carefully crafted like armor. Walking through airports, standing in lobbies, sipping coffee behind tinted sunglasses, it didn't matter. Eyes followed. Cameras clicked. Even when they pretended not to recognize me, there was that slight tension in their posture, that flicker in their gaze, the way whispers trailed behind me like smoke. I had become a myth, and myths are not allowed to be human. The next leg of the tour was Europe. Paris, Berlin, London, cities that once lived only in the dreams I scribbled into margins. I thought the distance might make it easier to breathe, that being across an ocean from the ghosts of my past would soften their grip. I was wrong. London was where it happened, the moment that shifted everything. The venue was massive. A sea of faces stretched into the horizon, lights glittering like constellations in the dark. The show was flawless. Every beat, every note, every visual timed to perfection. By the time I hit the final chorus of the encore, the entire stadium was singing back to me, voices melding into one vast, unstoppable wave. I should have been high on it, drunk on the power. But instead, as I stood there soaking in the roar, something cold slithered through me. It was a memory. Homecoming dance. 17 years old, standing alone by the bleachers wearing a suit I had stitched together myself. Patchwork velvet, mismatched buttons, a collar that shimmered in shades of midnight. I thought I looked like a star. They thought I looked like a joke. Laughter ricocheted around the gymnasium like gunfire, and I stood there, hands in my pockets, pretending it didn't hurt. The memory hit me like a punch to the gut. I blinked, and suddenly the roaring crowd wasn't a stadium. They were a gym full of sneering faces. The cheers twisted in my ears, morphing into laughter. My lungs clenched. For a split second, I felt like that kid again. Small, exposed, ridiculous. I almost faltered. Almost. But then I looked down at my hands, painted gold, gripping the mic like a sword, down at my body, draped in a custom design worth more than my childhood home, down at the platform I stood on, literally elevated above the world that once tried to bury me. And I laughed, loud, clear, into the mic. The sound boomed across the stadium and the crowd fell silent, confused. I leaned forward, my voice a low purr. You ever think about how funny it is? I asked them. How the same things they mocked you for, they end up paying tickets to see? The silence deepened. A hush. A tension. I paced the stage, the heels of my boots clicking like a metronome. I used to get laughed at for dressing like this, for moving like this, for thinking like this. I gestured to the dazzling chaos of lights and projections swirling behind me. They told me to tone it down, to fit in, to be normal. I stopped center stage, eyes scanning the crowd. But here's the thing about normal, I said. It's just a word people use when they're scared to be extraordinary. A pause. Then, like a match dropped into gasoline, the stadium erupted, the kind of roar that shakes your bones, that vibrates through your skull and leaves you trembling. I let it wash over me, let it fill the cracks those old memories had tried to pry open. Backstage after the show, my phone buzzed with notifications, headlines already being written, clips of my impromptu speech going viral, fans dissecting every word. The team buzzed around me, euphoric, calling it a genius move, branding it as a defining moment. But I wasn't thinking about any of that. I was thinking about the message waiting for me on my phone. It was from my mother. Saw the London show. You've come so far. Proud of you. No punctuation, no emojis, just flat, clinical pride. I stared at the screen for a long time, my thumb hovering over the reply button. I could say something polite, something neutral. I could ignore it entirely. Or I could say what I really felt. I typed, "You didn't believe in this. Not once." I stared at the words. My heart hammered. Then, slowly, I deleted them. Letter by letter. I closed the message without replying. Because what was the point? No response I could give her would ever bridge the distance between who I had been and who I had become. Some gaps aren't meant to be crossed. Instead, I threw my phone onto the couch and walked over to the dressing room mirror. The person staring back at me was unrecognizable from the kid who once begged to be seen. My face was painted in streaks of silver and black, eyes lined with kohl so thick it turned them into smoldering voids. My hair was a sculpted masterpiece, an explosion of color and shape, defying gravity. The costume was an architectural marvel, sharp lines, glowing seams, metallic fabrics that shimmered with every breath. But beneath it all, under the layers of paint and fabric and persona, I was still just that weird kid who used to doodle on textbook covers. Still the teenager who hid in bathroom stalls to avoid hallway taunts. Still the outcast who found solace in worlds no one else could see. Maybe that's why the success felt so hollow sometimes. Because no matter how loud they cheered now, it would never erase the silence of all the times they turned away. But then again, maybe that's what made it all so poetic. The underdog doesn't just win, the underdog becomes unstoppable. The next day, my team announced an extra date in my hometown. A special, intimate performance at the venue that had once rejected me. The internet exploded. Old classmates started posting about it, sharing yearbook photos, tagging me in nostalgic throwbacks, trying to hitch their wagons to my comet. I watched it all unfold with a strange detachment. Let them scramble for scraps of a legacy they never believed in. I had a show to plan, and this time I was bringing all the ghosts with me. It was a foggy morning when the jet touched down in the city that used to haunt me. The skyline hadn't changed much. The same water-stained overpasses, the same broken symmetry of half-rebuilt buildings and brick schools with chain-link fences biting at their perimeters. It all looked smaller now, like someone had shrunk it in a snow globe. Or maybe it was me who had outgrown the scale. Everything was still where I left it, but I didn't belong to it anymore. The car ride from the airport to the venue was quiet. My team sat with their phones glowing, answering press inquiries, confirming last-minute logistics. I leaned against the window and watched my childhood pass in snapshots. The laundromat I used to sketch in, the park bench where I first choreographed a dance in my head, the record store where I bought my first synth for 12 crumpled bills and a borrowed 10. Every corner held a memory, some bitter, some so tender they hurt more than the cruel ones. We drove by my old school. The parking lot looked smaller than I remembered. A janitor pushed a cart across the cracked pavement. I stared at the front steps where I once stood in hand-painted boots waiting for a ride that never came. That afternoon, I'd walked home through the rain, mascara bleeding down my face, carrying a rejection letter folded like a knife in my back pocket. That was the day I swore I'd never beg to be accepted again. Now here I was, the city's prodigal anomaly, coming back not to ask, not to apologize, not to be seen, but to take up space like I was born to. The venue was sold out. Not just packed, but overflowing. Lines wrapped around the block. Fans clutching homemade banners and wearing replicas of my most infamous outfits. My face was on every billboard, my voice pouring from every speaker. Local news anchors were using words like legend, visionary, a hometown triumph. They interviewed my old gym teacher like he'd been an early believer. He hadn't. I remembered how he'd once told me to try less hard when I showed up to track practice in glittery sneakers. Inside the venue, they had draped the walls in velvet and neon. The stage was a cathedral of light and movement, a breathing organism made of wires, screens, and scaffolding. My dressing room was filled with letters, hundreds of them, from fans, from collaborators, from people who had once labeled themselves misfits, until my existence told them they weren't mistakes. And then came the envelope, thicker than the others, a handwritten address. I opened it slowly. Inside was a letter. No pretense, no flattery, just the truth. It was from one of the boys who used to torment me in school, one of the loud ones, the ringleaders. I didn't even know he knew how to write like this. He said he saw the tour announcement and it shook something in him. He wrote about his own demons, how he didn't know how to process the rage he felt when someone dared to shine in a world that told him to stay small. He said he remembered every word he threw at me, and that every one of them had followed him into adulthood like shadows he couldn't step out of. He ended the letter with a sentence I never thought I'd read. You won, and I am relieved that you did. I set the letter down, not angry, not satisfied either, just quiet. Because this wasn't about revenge anymore. It never really had been. I didn't climb out of the pit to push anyone in. I climbed because I had to. Because staying buried in their definitions of me would have been a slow, quiet death. My victory wasn't in their regret. It was in my freedom. Showtime came faster than expected. The stadium dimmed. The crowd surged. Lights dropped into darkness, and a single spotlight lit the center of the stage. I walked out to a roar that could have cracked the sky. But I wasn't overwhelmed this time. I didn't shrink. I didn't flinch. I stood tall. My suit was a masterpiece. Layers of color and chaos, lines that made no architectural sense but moved like living geometry. My face was painted with the same shapes I used to scribble on the backs of homework, sharp spirals, constellations, questions with no answers. My boots glittered with shattered glass under the lights. The first half of the show was electric, seamless. Songs that once existed only in midnight whispers now blasted into the air with seismic clarity. Choreography that echoed the awkward dances I used to do in my bedroom now unfolded like rituals across the stage. The crowd moved with me like one massive, breathing organism. And then, halfway through, everything stopped. The stage fell silent. I stepped forward. No music, no visuals. Just me, the mic, and the city that once told me I was too strange to ever be seen. I remember the first time someone told me I was too much, I began. Too loud, too weird, too out there. The crowd hushed. I was 7 years old, dancing in the grocery store aisle, singing to myself, and someone looked at me like I was broken. I paused. I believed them for a long time, that there was something wrong with the way I see the world, that my colors were too bright, my voice too sharp, my dreams too impossible. I scanned the crowd. But you're here. You're all here. Which means they were wrong. And they weren't just wrong about me. They were wrong about every single one of you who's ever been told to dim your light, just to make someone else feel comfortable in the dark. The cheers started soft, then built, then exploded. I closed my eyes. Let it settle. Then I whispered, just loud enough for the mic to catch it. Thank you for letting me be everything they told me not to be. The rest of the show burned with something new. Not fire for vengeance, but fire for love. Love of art. Love of self. Love of a world I carved with my own hands when theirs tried to erase me. And when the last note rang out, when the lights burst into gold and the confetti fell like ashes from some divine celebration, I stood center stage, alone. I looked out at thousands of faces. Old classmates in the balcony, my mother in the front row, hands clutched in silence. Former teachers watching with hesitant pride, friends who had never doubted, and strangers who had found themselves in my voice. I took a breath, bowed once, and left the stage, not running, not hiding, not shrinking, but walking, slow, deliberate, unstoppable. In the hallway backstage, a small mirror hung crooked on the wall. I caught my reflection as I passed. No masks, no projections, just me. And I smiled without apology. I was never too weird. I was just ahead of the curve. And now, finally, the world had caught up,